All right, so we are continuing our study of the minor prophets. Thus far, we've covered Jonah and then Amos, and last time we finished Hosea. So going through kind of a broad timeline, around 1000 BC, we have David coronated and ruling in Jerusalem. We move forward around 930 or so. We have the division of the kingdoms. We keep going through. And Jonah is our first prophet chronologically. He was ministering sometime in the first half of the Jeroboam II. You can kind of see the top about halfway up. And then Amos is sent also during the time of Jeroboam II, when there are no more prophets. So presumably something has happened to Jonah, because there are no prophets left in Israel. And we typically date Amos to the second half of Jeroboam's reign. And then Hosea shows up, and he's ministering. We mainly associate him with after Jeroboam, through the reigns of Pekah and Hoshea, since he talks about the treaties with Egypt that would put him during the time of Hoshea, so the last official king of Israel. And again, we generally date Hosea to before the fall of Israel. And tonight, the next prophet will be Micah, who I think is a lot of fun to study. And it begins, the word of the Lord that came to Micah the Morashite, what he saw regarding Samaria and Jerusalem in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So we're told, so you can see here on our kind of timeline, Jotham is right below Hosea. Ahaz then is coming after Jotham, and then Hezekiah. We typically put the majority of Micah's ministry during the time of Hezekiah and during the fall of Israel. So this is from Barker's commentary. The book of Micah dates itself to the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. The maximum period for Micah's prophetic ministry would be 750 to 686. The minimum time would be 735 to 715. Most scholars place his activity somewhere between these two extremes. Okay, that's just a guess. Though few would begin his ministry much earlier than 735 or ended later than 700. This means that Micah's ministry overlapped with Isaiah and Hosea, but his ministry was closest to that of Isaiah in both time and place. So, so this is, that shaded area is generally where he dates his own ministry, but historically, canonically, just traditionally, we tend to associate Micah's ministry, at least the main part of his ministry, right around the fall of Israel. So here on our kind of relative timeline, you got Jonah, who's in the first third of the 8th century, Amos and Hosea, who are both contemporaries, both mid-8th century. Hosea has a fairly long ministry, but we kind of date him to the end of Jeroboam, to the right after. And then Micah and Isaiah are both primarily active in the end of the 8th century, specifically leading up to the Assyrian invasion and the fall. So Micah and Isaiah are contemporaries. That's always been accepted. Again, Micah, as far as we know, overlaps a little bit with Hosea. Isaiah also has a very long ministry. So Isaiah, we can back up quite a bit. But again, the majority, or the main part of his ministry we think of when we think of Isaiah is during the Assyrian invasion. So again, I put Micah and Isaiah together, which is what most people do. And I kind of joke about this, but I think it's rather appropriate. When we're thinking about the book of Micah, I was talking to a professor, and he was, when he heard that I was doing a study on the minor prophets a while back, he's like, so which one do you not like? Because there's one you're not going to like. And he admitted to me that he didn't care for Micah, which I was rather surprised by. Like, of all the prophets, you don't like Micah. How can you not like Micah? If I had to summarize Micah, it would be he's essentially Cliff Notes Isaiah. And it might be because Isaiah is a very prominent, very popular, big ministry prophet. Isaiah would have been very well known. He had been very prominent. Whereas Micah might be a bit smaller time. And so a lot of the issues, a lot of the themes, a lot of the ideas in Isaiah are going to be found in Micah, although greatly condensed because Micah is only about 7 chapters. So thus far we've done Jonah, and then we did Amos, we did Hosea, and we are currently going to be looking at Micah. And if we're kind of walking through how they relate to each other, we'll say chronologically, Jonah introduces us to the idea of divine judgment. We've talked about this, and how God sent him to the Assyrians to warn him, and that even the warning of judgment is still revelation, and that still allows for the people to respond, which they do, and God postpones the judgment of Assyria. Then we have Amos and Hosea that I lump together, because they're both directing judgment against Judah. Amos more generally, and with some focus on social justice, whereas Hosea is going to be much more specific with a focus on the cultic infidelity, right? His connection to the Hosea and Gomer story. But both of them, in passing, will talk about, with Amos especially, he will tease the idea of the remnant. So even as early as Amos, we're talking about the promise that God's not going to completely wipe out his people. So in 5:15, perhaps the Lord, the God of hosts, will be gracious to the remnant of Joseph. So even that early, we have that language. And then 9:11, we have the promise that there's going to be the restoration of the house of David, which can refer to the country as well as the monarchy. And of course, he's talking to Israel, but he's using this clearly in very broad language to refer to all of Israel, so Israel and Judah. And then Hosea has a lot to say, although this, again, I wouldn't say is the main theme, but he has quite a lot to talk about regarding the royalty, so the aspect of the kingship. So, and 3:4, for the Israelites must live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred pillar, and without ephod or household idols. Afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. So, there's going to be a period where Israel will not have a king. Now, we already know, or at least as we go through the book, that they've been killing off their kings. The thrones become kind of a rotating door. And they've gotten to the point culturally where they basically don't even respect the king. They act as though they don't need a king or don't have a king. So there's a lot of condemnation on the kingship in Hosea. And so he's like, for a while, you're not going to have a king at all, because God's going to judge the royal line. But then in chapter 10, in fact, they are now saying, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. What can a king do for us? So we've got this problem in Hosea, namely that there's no respect for the king. There's what's going to happen with the throne, what's going to happen with all of that. And Hosea doesn't really give us the answer. So Amos teases the idea of the remnant. Hosea teases this idea that the kingship's going to be removed. But there's really no clear answer in either book. That is where Micah comes in. So Micah is going to carry both of these ideas forward and give us some closure, or at least some idea of where this is heading. So multiple commentaries complain or say that there's no good way to outline the book. I disagree. I think that I'm quite happy with this outline. So the first 2 chapters are going to largely be lament. We see this in poetry a lot. And this is basically just Micah's complaining to Yahweh about the current situation. Namely, the Assyrians are here, and they're going to wipe out Israel. So he has clearly a lot to complain about and a lot of woes to give. He's not the only prophet to write laments. Of course, Jeremiah does, Ezekiel does. When we think of lamentations or woes, we immediately think of Jeremiah, but again, plenty of other prophets do that, like Ezekiel. Then, if we jump down, chapters 6 and 7 are going to be a pronouncement of judgment. So he's going to kind of reiterate what we already know, but he's going to put his own spin on it as to why it is necessary that Israel is judged. Amos has already said this, Hosea has already said this, but Micah is going to give us his own little synopsis. But in between, we have what I think is really the heart of Micah, which is his sermon on leadership, where he's going to be talking about the failure of the leadership in Israel. Hosea had a lot to say, particularly about the priesthood and the religious leaders, although he touched on the political leaders. Micah's going to have a lot more to say about the political leadership and the failure in that regard. So in my mind, you got the first 2 chapters, which are dealing with just kind of his general lament. You got the last 2 chapters, which are dealing with the judgment of Israel. And then in between, you have this sermon against the leaders and what's going to come from that. So, we will begin tonight with the first two chapters. Just take our time and enjoy it, because Micah's a great book. It begins, "The word of the Lord that came to Micah, the Morashite, what he saw regarding Samaria and Jerusalem in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah." So this gives us a general time frame. Again, we're talking about these last three kings leading up to the invasion of Samaria. We assume that he's writing, that the book is being written as the invasion is ongoing. This would put us during the time of Hezekiah mainly. He is from Morashah, which I'm sure you all know where that is, but just to remind those who don't, here's our map of Judah. The yellow is Jerusalem, where you kind of know where Jerusalem is. That's our main point of orientation. If you go more or less straight down, you'll hit Hebron. That's a fairly major city. That's where David was originally crowned. And then to the west of Hebron is Morashah. What's significant about Morashah? Micah's from there. There doesn't seem to be much more significance to that than this is just where Micah's from. So here we have my more specific timeline, and at this point we're wrapping up the 8th century. So you can see Jonah kind of in the first third, Amos somewhere in the middle, Hosea somewhere in the second half, Isaiah, nice long ministry covering the last third, and then Micah somewhere in the time frame of Isaiah, but again, mostly we orient him to the invasion, so around 720, 730, somewhere in that window. All right, so verse 2. "Listen, all you peoples, pay attention, earth and everyone in it. The Lord God will be a witness against you." So right off the bat, we have sort of a major declaration of judgment. Again, this has already been building. Amos has been building it, Hosea has been building to it, and now Micah is giving a formal pronouncement of judgment. He's proclaiming to the people, and he proclaims to earth itself, but ultimately it is Yahweh. Yahweh is going to be the witness in this accusation. There is no one higher to invoke. Right? He's got the people covered, he's got the earth covered, and now he's invoking Yahweh. Yahweh is invoked in a couple of places as witness. You've got Laban. So when Laban makes his covenant with Jacob, he invokes Yahweh. The elders of Gilead in Judges 11, they invoke Yahweh. Jonathan, when he makes his covenant with David in 1 Samuel 20, he invokes Yahweh. But this is just kind of a general Yahweh as witness. There's nothing really negative about this, whereas Micah is calling Yahweh as a witness in a case of judgment. Right? This is like a court case. He's bringing formal accusations against Israel. This is incredibly rare, but it does happen. In fact, I have no idea who was here, but you all should be somewhat familiar with this because Samuel does it. Back in 1 Samuel 12, he said to them, "The Lord is a witness against you, and his anointed is a witness today that you haven't found anything in my hand. He is a witness," they said. So this is when the people have told Samuel they're tired of him being judge. They don't want his sons to be judges, and they want a king. And Samuel basically pronounces judgment against Israel and calls on Yahweh as his witness. Like, this is a really big mistake. So I'm calling on Yahweh, first of all, because I'm innocent, and he's the only one who can prove that I'm innocent. Also, you guys are the worst. You shouldn't be doing this. I'm calling on Yahweh so that he knows that you're making a big mistake. So this has been done, and it's interesting. I like that we're making this connection early on because it seems like throughout Micah, we're going to see little sprinkles of connections within the book of Samuel to David as well as Saul. So it's, as far as I can tell, the author Micah, the prophet Micah, he was probably familiar with the book of Samuel, or at least very intimately familiar with the stories in Samuel, because it seems like we get a couple of references to Samuel. So verse 2, "Listen, all you peoples, pay attention, earth and everyone in it. The Lord God will be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple." Now, this is fun, and I just like going into the kind of stuff. There is no word in Hebrew for temple. there is the word hekal. And hekal is just a word for big fancy place. And it can be used in a lot of contexts. Now, the primary way that we associate it is the house of God, which is called a hekal. And when we typically think of buildings dedicated to the god, we call them temples, although they can also be called sanctuaries, although that's usually a different word, because you can also call it a holy place, and sanctus is from holy, so we make that association. But you can also have very important, powerful people who lives in hekal. We typically call those palaces. And there are other ways to translate it as well. So when David, right, wants to make a hekal for God, he's already made a hekal for himself. He's already made his own palace, and now he wants a place for Yahweh to live, and they're going to be neighbors, right? Because he wants them right next to where he lives. So Yahweh's hekal will be next to his hekal on Mount Zion. Pretty much every translation just immediately translates this as temple. The only one that kind of breaks this mold is the net, which I'm really impressed with because this is all going to be royal imagery moving forward. And it seems like he's not describing Yahweh in his physical earthly temple. He's talking about Yahweh in heaven, where Yahweh naturally resides. So it is his dwelling place up there somewhere. And it's his hekal. Again, in Hebrew, they just have the one word. We have to narrow it down, either calling it temple, which has a religious connotation, or we call it a palace, which has a royal implication. Again, in Hebrew, they don't make a distinction. I kind of like what the net does here by calling it palace, because that sets us off right at the beginning that we're dealing with a royal image, right? That Yahweh is king, and he is being evoked in his more political and royal capacity, not necessarily just a religious capacity. So the Lord will be a witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple palace. Look, the Lord is leaving his place and coming down to trample the heights of the earth. So, what's being described here? Yahweh is up in the heavens. He's residing in his abode, his residence, and he is there enthroned, and it's good that he's up there, right? He's sitting on his throne, he's ruling the heavens, he's got an important job. And going with that imagery, right, you have, and we can make an analogy to kings, but just any patriarchal figure, right? When he's in his residence and he is enthroned in, his patriarchal status or whatever, generally speaking, he doesn't like to be disturbed. He likes sitting, he likes ruling from that place, right? He's happy. And we're happy to see him happy. Because when Yahweh is enthroned, he's ruling. However, at times, he needs to get up. He needs to get up from his throne. He needs to get up from wherever he is sitting. And that's often a bad thing. You usually don't want the king to get up, because the kings don't want to get up. Because if the king gets up, he has to do something. And it's usually because there's a problem that he has to deal with. So when the king's enthroned, that's good. When the king stands up, that's bad. And Yahweh has to stand up. He has to get off his throne and deal with something. So he is now coming in judgment. We've already had this kind of teased. Again, Micah is just going to pull all this out and focus on the remnant language as well as the royal language. So back in Amos 4, therefore, Israel, this is what I will do to you, and since I will do that to you, Israel, prepare to meet your God. That is not a, yay, we're meeting God. That is a, no, we are meeting God. This is very negative language. This is judgment. God is coming in judgment. He is here, the one who forms the mountains, creates the wind, and reveals his thoughts to man, the one who makes the dawn out of darkness and strides on the heights of the earth. Yahweh, the God of hosts, is his name. And so he is coming in his official capacity as king of creation. Again, kings don't like being disturbed. And generally speaking, as subjects, you don't want to disturb the king. You don't want to rouse the king because when the king gets off his throne, he's got to do something. Just like Dad was on the couch, he doesn't want to get off the couch. And if the kids are disturbing him and he has to get off the couch, the kids aren't going to be happy. no one's going to be happy because we just let dad on the couch and do what he wants to do or what he needs to do. Just leave him alone. The mountains will melt beneath him, and the valleys will split apart like wax near a fire, like water cascading down a mountainside. So this is kind of twofold. On the one hand, you just have, well, I don't know which one to start with. On the one hand, you have just simple procession language. The king is coming, and all of creation is getting ready for the coming of the king. On the other hand, you have judgment. The king is angry that he has to get off his throne. The king is angry that he has to leave his residence. And so everything is kind of melting away around him because he is angry and wrathful. We get this exact same kind of imagery in Isaiah. This should not surprise us because Micah and Isaiah are writing at the same time, and there's going to be a lot of overlap between Micah and Isaiah. You'll feel like at times that we're just reading Isaiah, which is good too. So back in Isaiah 40, a voice of one crying out, "Prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness. Make a straight highway for our God in the desert. Every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain and hill will be leveled. The uneven ground will become smooth, and the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will appear, and all humanity together will see it." So Isaiah is describing the exact same thing. Yahweh is getting off of his throne, and he is coming to Israel in judgment. Now, we don't have this as much anymore, but we do have sort of the residue of monarchy. I have never been here for this, but probably the closest thing in our culture we can compare this to is the U.S. president. Now, when the president is in the White House, there's a flag on the top and everything goes as normal. But when the president has to leave the White House, I've not been in D.C. for this, but what I've been told and what seems to be confirmed over and over again is it basically shuts down D.C. The streets have to be cleared. And the Secret Service have to scout the way ahead. They have to get helicopters and snipers. They have to get the army mobilized because they have to prepare the way for the president because they have to make sure that it's safe. And it turns into a parade. Like people come, they swarm the streets because they want to see the presidential motorcade as it goes by. Nothing has changed in 2,000-3,000 years. When the king leaves, it's a big deal. And when the king leaves, he has to leave with his entourage, with his troops, with his soldiers who are there to not only make his way safe, but also to prepare it. And everyone knows the king is coming. In fact, most of the ancient roads back then, the big ones, are often referred to as the king's roads because they were made in advance so that the king had a way to go that was safe and smooth and so on. So when Isaiah and Micah are both describing and saying, "Prepare the way of the Lord," this is very royal language because they would understand what this meant because that's what the kings had to do. They sent their men ahead to prepare everything for his safe passage, just like today in D.C. when the Secret Service has to go and clear the roads for the president. Again, not much has changed. There are plenty of verses we could go to, but Proverbs is good. Proverbs 19. "A king's rage is like the roaring of a lion, but his favor is like the dew of the grass." And we've already seen this in both Amos and Hosea. Yahweh described as a very angry lion because he is angry at Israel. He's angry what Israel has done, and he has to respond. So Amos 1:2, of course, begins, and then throughout the whole book we get this recurring lion image. The Lord roars from Zion and raises his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the summit of Carmel withers. Like creation itself is responding to the anger of Yahweh. Hosea 5, "For I am like a lion to Ephraim and like a young lion to the house of Judah. Yes, I will tear them to pieces and depart. I will carry them off, and no one can rescue them." Of course, Hosea also talks about how Yahweh is the Savior. So if Yahweh is the one who saves, then when he is angry against Israel and Judah, there's no one to stop him because he's the only one who's capable of saving them. So it's kind of double-edged sword. So verse 5. "All this will happen because of Jacob's rebellion and the sins of the house of Israel." We've already been notified that Israel is in sin, that Israel has created rebellion, and that Yahweh is angry at Israel, and the judgment is coming. So Amos 3:13, "Listen and testify against the house of Jacob. This is the declaration of the Lord God, the God of hosts. And Hosea 1:4, I will bring the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu and put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. On that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. So we already should know this. So verse 5, what is the rebellion of Jacob? Isn't it Samaria? And what is the high place of Judah? Isn't it Jerusalem? So this is kind of rhetorical, obviously, and we should more or less be familiar. Samaria, while we think of it later in the New Testament as just a synonymous term for what is left of Israel, is also a city, and that's where most of the kings of Israel have resided, so it's the capital of northern Israel. And of course, Jerusalem we know is the capital of Judah. So we should already be familiar with this, right? These are the capital cities, and they're the heart of the rebellion against Yahweh. Jacob is in rebellion. Jacob is in sin. We also have been told that so is Judah. So Amos has already said, right back in Amos 4, therefore, Israel, this is what I will do to you, and since I will do that to you, Israel, prepare to meet your God. He is here, the one who forms the mountains. That's not the right verse. That's not the right verse. But we've already talked about how in his judgment of the nations, Judah is already being judged. However, the immediate dealings is going to be with Israel, and then once Israel's dealt with, then God's going to turn his attention to Judah. So verse 6, therefore I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the countryside, a planting area for a vineyard. I will roll her stones into the valley and expose her foundations. We've already seen vineyard language. We have back in Amos, therefore, because you trample on the poor and exact a grain tax from him, you will never live in the houses of cut stone you have built. You will never drink the wine from the lush vineyards you have planted. Amos brings up the vineyards in a few places. Hosea mentions them in passing. But the idea that God is going to remove Israel. We also have, and I mentioned this with Hosea, you have the judgment against Ahaz for stealing the vineyard from Nadab. So he's going to judge Israel and turn the land into territory that can be replanted. So, of course, he's going to uproot Israel so that the land can be prepared and cleansed, essentially. Verse 7, all her carved images will be smashed to pieces, all her wages will be burned in the fire, and I will destroy all her idols. Now, Amos doesn't talk too much about the idolatry problem. He mentions in passing that they are living in sin, although he focuses more on the cultural, social sins. And he does mention that they are trying, or at least they pretend to worship Yahweh while they're living in sin, which makes Yahweh angry. But he doesn't really talk a whole lot about their idolatry beyond that. Hosea has a lot to say, though. So Amos 4, come to Bethel and rebel even more at Gilgal, bring your sacrifices every morning, your tithes every 3 days, offer leavened bread as a thank offering, and loudly proclaim your free will offerings, for this is what you Israelites love to do. Again, he's talking mainly about how they're living in sin, and then they will make their offerings, or they'll pretend to worship God while living in sin. But he doesn't talk a whole lot about like their worshiping of Baal or other gods. Hosea does. So Hosea gives us that side of, I hate the metaphor, but he gives us that side of the coin, right? So Hosea 4, my people consult their wooden idols and their divining rods inform them, for a spirit of promiscuity leads them astray. They act promiscuously in disobedience to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and they burn offerings on the hills and under oaks, poplars, and terebinths because their shade is pleasant. So yes, Hosea lets us know that they are practicing idolatry and they're worshiping other gods. Well, that's how Amos presents it, yeah. So then, the very end of 7, all her wages will be burned in the fire, and I will destroy all her idols. Since she collected the wages of a prostitute, they will be used again for a prostitute. So this may seem a little random, or at least kind of at odds, but we already know from Hosea, right, that Israel has been engaged in idolatry, and her idolatry has been compared to adultery and even more so to prostitution. So when Micah is now comparing, again, the idolatry to prostitution, this could be indication that he's familiar with Hosea. So he's kind of picking up that same idea, that the idolatry is synonymous with cultic infidelity, which is connected to the idea of basically selling herself to the other gods as a form of prostitution. And all of this will be judged. So verse 8, because of this I will lament and wail, I will walk barefoot and naked, I will howl like the jackals and mourn like ostriches. So, yeah, we're in the lament section, so he's complaining, he's wailing, he's gnashing his teeth, all because of not only what Israel has done, but also because of the punishment that's going to come upon Israel. The walking barefoot and naked is interesting because it's a little specific. And we have another prophet who talked about walking around barefoot and naked. So, and I've mentioned this before, that when it comes to the prophets, they preach, they have visions, but sometimes they will also do performative prophecies. Well, they will act out something. One of the more famous examples, of course, is Hosea marrying Gomer as sort of an allegory for Yahweh's relationship with Israel. However, there are plenty of other prophets who do these sort of performance prophecies. You got Elijah, Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and so on. One of the most famous, however, other than Hosea, is going to be Isaiah. And one of his more famous or infamous prophecies is when he was commanded to walk around Jerusalem naked. And we won't read all of it, but God tells him to strip off your clothes and then walk around the city. And when people ask you, Isaiah, why are you walking around the city naked? Tell them, well, because the Assyrians are coming. And when they come, they're going to take you away naked. So when Micah is here talking about wailing and walking around naked, this, again, could be an indication he's familiar with Isaiah, maybe a reference to what Isaiah has done. Because this would get a lot of attention. You know, some prophet just walking around the city naked. I imagine people would talk about that. So verse 9, for her wound is incurable and has reached even Judah. It has approached the gate of my people as far as Jerusalem. This has also been touched on by both Amos and Hosea. So in Amos 2, I will not relent from punishing Judah because they have rejected the instruction of the Lord. They have not kept his statutes. The lies that their ancestors followed have led them astray. Therefore, I will send fire against Judah and it will consume the citadels of Jerusalem. So Amos has already told us that Judah is going to be judged, but Hosea actually mentions and draws attention to that part of why Israel is also being judged is because she is leading her sister in sin. So Judah is seeing what Israel is doing, and Judah decides it wants to be like Israel. And so God is punishing Israel for leading Judah astray. So Hosea 4:15, Israel, you have acted promiscuously. Don't let Judah become guilty. Do not go to Gilgal and make a pilgrimage to Beth-aven. And then in 5:5, Israel's arrogance testifies against them. Both Israel and Ephraim stumble because of their wickedness. Even Judah will stumble with them. So Micah is just picking up on this same idea, that Israel is leading Judah astray. Verse 10, don't announce it in Gath. Don't weep at all. So Israel is going to be judged. And there's no avoiding it at this point. So now he says, don't pronounce it, don't publicize it, don't let the other nations know because they're going to gloat about it, because they're going to brag about it. They're going to get happy because Israel's going to be punished. Now, this should also sound rather familiar because it's also talked about in Samuel. So after Saul dies, we have the splendor of Israel lies slain on your heights, how the mighty have fallen. Do not tell it in Gath. Don't announce it in the marketplaces of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice, and the daughters of the uncircumcised will gloat. So very, very similar language. Right? Don't let the foreign nations know what's going to happen. In fact, we're going to get a couple of prophets will talk about when, after Israel and Judah have been judged by Yahweh, part of their indictment against the other nations is how they have boasted over the destruction of Israel and Judah. And like, you weren't supposed to do that. So God's not angry that you're gloating that they were wiped out. He talks about like with Edom and others. So we're going to get a series of cities, and it seems like most of these involve some sort of wordplay or just kind of some sort of play with the idea. Verse 10, roll in the dust in Beth Leaphra. So Leaphra is from Ophrah, which is another word for dust. So roll in the dust, you city of the dust, which I guess is clever. Depart in shameful nakedness, you residents of Shaphir. Shaphir is a word for pleasant. So, depart in shameful nakedness, which doesn't sound very pleasant at all. So he's like, you city that is called pleasant or known for pleasant things or whatever are going to be treated in a very unpleasant way. So again, you got kind of this play on ideas. The residents of Za'anan. Za'anan apparently is based on the word to come out or exit. It's one of their words for that. So the residents of Za'anan will not come out. So the residents of come out city will not come out. Again, we got their word plays. Beth Ezel, which Ezel has something to do with being near or close in proximity. So Beth Ezel is lamenting that support is taken from you. So it's, the help that should be close is not going to be near the city that is called City of Nearness. That seems to be what they're saying. He's a pastor making bad puns. I don't know what to say about this other than that. Verse 12, though the residents of Maroth anxiously wait for something good. Maroth is perhaps tied to the word for Mara. So Maroth, Mara meaning bitter. So the residents of a town, the town means bitter, wait for something good. So the towns of, the residents of bitter town want something good, which they're not going to get. Disaster has come from the Lord to the gate of Jerusalem. And we could even go with the joke there that disaster has come to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, of course, famously means city of peace. So disaster has come to the place of peace. So again, a bunch of kind of puns and word plays. Verse 13, harness the horses to the chariot, you residents of Lachish. I don't think the word itself means horses, but Lachish is known for breeding horses. Apparently there's a few references in the Bible where they bred horses there. So you got a town that's known for raising horses, and he's saying you can go and harness your horses and try and run away. The assumption being you're not going to escape this. So even if you have the means, like the horses, you're not going to escape the Assyrians. This was the beginning of sin for daughter Zion because Israel's acts of rebellion can be traced to you. So now we get a reference to daughter Zion, which is mostly associated with Isaiah. Again, Micah and Isaiah have a lot in common. Isaiah loves to use the phrase daughter Zion in reference to Jerusalem as well as just the nation of Judah. It's one of his favorite expressions. So the fact that Micah here is talking or referring to daughter Zion could be an indication that he's, on the same wavelength as Isaiah. Daughter Zion is abandoned like a shelter in a vineyard, like a shack in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we'd be like Sodom, we would resemble Gomorrah. So verse 14, therefore send farewell gifts to Moresheth Gath. The houses of Akzib are a deception. So Akzib is another word for deceive. I meant to correct that. So the house of deception are being deceived to the kings of Israel. I will bring a conqueror against you who live in Marashah. It's not that the word means it necessarily, but apparently in Hebrew, the word conqueror sounds very similar to Marashah. So I will bring a conqueror to, again, the words are just very, very close. The nobility of Israel will come to Adullam. So Adullam should sound familiar. Because again, we went through Samuel together. So Adullam is where the cave was that David hid from Saul. So, again, it seems like we get a couple of, or some very explicit references back to Samuel, and this is one of the more obvious ones. So all of these horrible things are going to happen to these cities, and he's using all these word plays and imagery to kind of give you an idea of how bad it's going to be. And then he says the nobles of Israel will come, but more likely they're going to run away to Adullam. So just like David, right? Just like David fled from Saul and hid in the caves of Adullam, the nobles of Israel are going to run away and hide in the caves. Although it's not going to go very well for them. Verse 16, shave yourselves bald and cut off your hair and sorrow for your precious children. So, of course, cutting your hair is usually an indication of grief, mourning, and so on. So he's telling them, I guess proactively, go ahead and cut your hair because it's going to be a very bad time and you're going to be wailing, lamenting, and so on. Shave yourselves bald and cut off your hair and sorrow for your precious children. Make yourselves as bald as an eagle, for they have been taken from you into exile. So we get this fun little expression, bald like an eagle. And yes, I'm going to gripe because that's probably not a great translation choice, which you should be able to guess is probably not right. Eagles famously are not bald. They're not. Now, I know at least one of you is thinking, because you think you're being really clever. What about the bald eagle? The bald eagle isn't bald. It just has different colored head plumage. It's not bald. So what's going on here? Well, the thing is, Hebrew doesn't have multiple words for birds that fly really, really high. So they've got one word, nesher. And nesher refers to a certain kind of bird that's usually rather large and is known for soaring high up in the sky on air currents. Now, we have multiple words to describe birds that do this. This is the word that's used famously in Exodus 19:4. And yes, I'm going to ruin this verse for you. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I carried you on the wings of Nesher and brought you to me. So just take a moment to think about this, right? He brought them out of Egypt. He brought them through the desert. Carried them on wings of a big bird that flies really, really high. Now, I'm assuming all of you at some point in your life have seen a Western. So you've got Clint Eastwood, and he's riding his horse through the desert, and it's really hot. The sun's, bearing down on him, and he looks up. And he looks up and he sees these little birds way high up there, and they're just soaring above him. That's what he's describing here, because they're in the desert. Those are not good birds. Those are not a good sign when you see those birds circling above you. So now, to be fair, this word nesher, because it's vague, it can describe eagles. And one of the more common eagles in that part of the world is the golden eagle. It ain't bald. It does not look anything like the bald eagle, because again, bald eagle comes from North America. It can also describe, it is probably more likely to describe the griffin vulture, which is bald. It is very commonly found in the Sinai desert. Now, that really does change Exodus 19:4 if he's describing carrying them on the wings of a vulture. Because that evokes death. That evokes, we would think, a more negative indication, but again, he carried them on death, right? He carried them out of Egypt, and he killed the Egyptians, right? He did all that for them. So again, it does change the image a little bit, but again, probably a little more accurate. But he says, right, you'll be bald like the bird, and vultures, buzzards are known for being bald, right, because they're scavengers, and you can't get blood out of feathers, so they need their head to be clean. So shave yourselves bald and cut off your hair and sorrow for your precious children. Make yourselves as bald as a vulture, we could maybe say buzzard, for they have been taken from you into exile. Also, vultures tend to evoke a more negative image, more death. And this is clearly negative. Right? This is not a good scenario that they're in. Chapter 2. Woe to those who dream up wickedness and prepare evil plans on their beds. At morning light they accomplish it because the power is in their hands. They covet fields and seize them. They also take houses. They deprive a man of his home, a person of his inheritance. Now, this isn't good, and we'll get to why this is so important. At this point, he's talking a lot about, we could say, more social issues. Again, this resonates quite a lot with Amos, like in Amos 8. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and do away with the poor of the land, asking, when will the new moon be over so we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so we may market wheat? We can reduce the measure while increasing the price and cheat with dishonest scales. We can buy the poor with silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and even sell the chaff. So Amos has already kind of talked about the mistreatment of the poor. But Micah is bringing up a very specific issue. And so in order to understand this, we have to understand how Israel was kind of set up, right? They're brought out of the desert into the promised land, and then the land is apportioned to the various tribes and families. And the idea is that that is your land, that is your ancestral land, so that even if things get really, really bad, you still have land to go live on. You still have land you can work. You have a way to support yourself because you can grow crops and whatever. And in times of absolute need, you can sell that land. However, not permanently, because every 7 years, and ultimately the year of Jubilee, it will go back to your family. So it never leaves you permanently because you need that land to live on. And you need some source of sustenance, money, and whatnot. However, here, they're coveting land, they're seizing land, they're depriving people, not just by taking their land either through force or economics or whatever. The impression seems to be, and it feels like this is right, they're not giving it back. They're not returning the inheritance after the allotted time. So there's no permanent selling of property. It's more like an extended lease, right? And this is one of the issues with Ruth, right? That Naomi has Elimelech's land, and since she doesn't have any heirs, there's no one to leave it to, and so the nearest kinsman wants it for himself, whereas Boaz wants to give Ruth children so that the land would then go and stay in Elimelech's name, because we have an inheritance issue. And the nearer kinsman, the Poloni-Ammoni figure, is seen as evil because he doesn't want the land to stay in Elimelech's name. He wants the land for himself, and he assumes once his brother's widow is dead, he can just claim it for himself because there's no other family member to take it. And this is seen as very evil, very villainous. So we have people here that are not returning the land back to their proper ownership. So verse 3, therefore the Lord says, I am now planning a disaster against this nation. You cannot free your necks from it, then you will not walk so proudly, because it will be an evil time. And that day one will take up a taunt against you and lament mournfully, saying, we are totally ruined. We've already been sort of told about this. Amos said, the day of the Lord is coming, and it's not going to be good. Right? Yahweh is coming because, and we get into the same mentality. We think, oh, if only God would show up and make everything right. No, because we assume when we say that he'll make everything right means he will leave us alone. Everyone's going to get their just desserts. And so Amos is like, don't long for this, don't pray for it, because when he comes, he's going to deal with everything. He's not going to just pick and choose, I'll deal with this or deal with that or whatever. Everything's going to be righted. Verse 4, he measures out the allotted land of my people, how he removes it from me. He allots our fields to traders. Therefore, there will be no one in the assembly of the Lord to divide the land by casting lots. The point seems to be that they have, I think he's talking rhetorically, they have re-allotted the land against Yahweh's wishes, and he's not happy about that. And so he's basically going to pull them out of the land and redo the whole thing. because they have not been faithful and they have not been good stewards of the land like they were told to back in Moses' time. And we have the original allotting of the land back in Numbers 26. So the Lord said to Moses, the land is to be divided among them as an inheritance based on the number of names. Increase the inheritance for a large tribe and decrease it for a small one. Each is to be given its inheritance according to those who were registered. The land must be divided by lot. They will receive an inheritance according to the names of their ancestral tribes. Each inheritance will be divided by lot among the larger and smaller tribes. So the land was divided up according to how big the tribes were, and then it was cast by lots, and then that's your ancestral land. But they're not adhering to this anymore. Verse 6, quit your preaching, they preach. They should not preach these things. Shame will not overtake us. So this seems to be, they're not happy with the prophets who have come and warned them what has happened. That seems to be what's going on here. We already had a similar episode back in Amos. So in Amos 7, Amaziah, who was one of the false priests, he said to Amos, go away, you seer, flee to the land of Judah, earn your living and give your prophecies there, but don't ever prophesy at Bethel again, for it is the king's sanctuary and a royal temple. So Amos, right, he is sent because there aren't any prophets left. Something happened to them. And he's warning them that the Assyrians are coming, and the people aren't happy because it's not a good message, and they don't want to hear it. And Amos is like, I don't know, this is what God told me to do, so I'm going to do it. So here we got Micah, who seems like he's kind of mirroring the same thing, that they're asking him, or they're telling prophets like him to stop preaching because they don't like what they're hearing. So verse 7, house of Jacob, should it be asked, is the Spirit of the Lord impatient? Are these the things he does? Doesn't my word bring good to the one who walks uprightly? Well, I mean, they don't want to hear the message because it's kind of a message of doom and gloom. And he goes, well, I mean, it should be welcome to those who are doing the right thing. That sounds good, although I think the people who are complaining probably aren't living justly. So verse 8, but recently my people have risen up like an enemy. You strip off the splendid robe from those who are passing through confidently, like those returning from war. You force the women of my people out of their comfortable homes, and you take my blessing from their children forever. So again, they're abusing each other, they're mistreating each other. We get the forcing the women from their homes. Again, probably this is part of the inheritance issue. They're buying land, they're not giving it back. They're throwing widows and the women without husbands and children to take care of them. They're throwing them out, and they're depriving the orphans of a place to live and a way to take care of themselves. And as we should know, God does not take very kindly to people who mistreat widows and orphans. Verse 10, get up and leave, for this is not your place of rest, because defilement brings destruction, a grievous destruction. If a man of wind comes and invents lies, I will preach to you about wine and beer. He would be just the preacher for this people. So this is, I think, almost a funny verse. So if a man of wind comes, so I'm guessing that's just someone who's full of hot air, right? Someone who's speaking empty words or words without substance, and he's lying. So we get a preacher who shows up, who's full of hot air and lies, and he's just preaching wine and beer. I think that this is just almost a nonsensical expression. He's just preaching what they want to hear. He's preaching good times, right? Everything's gonna be fine. You're gonna have your land. You can go and drink. You can go and do what you want and just live it up. Everything's fine. And he goes, well, this is the preacher for the people. This is a preacher that the people want to hear, but he's not preaching what he's supposed to be preaching. So the fact that the people like him just kind of reinforces he's not a genuine preacher. Verse 12. I will indeed gather all of you, Jacob. I will collect the remnant of Israel. I will bring them together like sheep in a pen, like a flock in the middle of its fold. It will be noisy with people. So he is promising to gather them. We don't get the full idea. So is this a purely protective idea, right? He's going to take the remnant and put them in a place of protection. Or is this he's going to gather all of them and then sort them as he sees fit? So some will be protected, right? I'm thinking like Jesus talking about the separation of the rams and the sheep. So is this just purely protective, or is he going to put them all together, get them in a pen or whatever, and then start to sort them out? So some will be saved and some might not be saved. It's not clear. We've already had references, again, to the remnant Amos talks about in a few places, but in 3:12, the Lord says, as the shepherd snatches 2 legs or a piece of an ear from a lion's mouth, so the Israelites who live in Samaria will be rescued with only the corner of a bed or the cushion of a couch. And then in chapter 9, I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel. They will rebuild and occupy ruined cities, plant vineyards and drink their wine, make gardens and eat their produce. I will plant them on their land, and they will never again be uprooted from the land I have given them. Yahweh your God has spoken. So Amos has already told us that there's going to be a remnant, and the remnant will be allowed to return, and they will be given the land again, and it will not be taken from them. And Isaiah has a lot to say about the remnant. So just a few places, chapter 6. Though a tenth will remain in the land, it will be burned again like the terebinth or the oak that leaves a stump when felled. The holy seed is the stump. In chapter 10, Israel, even if your people were as numerous as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. Destruction has been decreed, justice overflows. Again, and Isaiah has a lot to say about the remnant. Verse 13, one who breaks open the way will advance before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and leave by it. Their king will pass through before them, the Lord as their leader. And so now I feel like we've come full circle because it all started, right? We started this section with the promise that Yahweh is getting off of his throne, right? He is leaving his residence, and he is coming in judgment. And then we get this description of woe because God is coming in judgment and bad things are going to happen. But here we're bringing to a nice little bookend to this section where he's saying again, right, the one is coming. One is coming who's going to break everything. And he is going to pass through the gate, right? This is Yahweh, and he is coming back to, we could say, he's coming back to Israel. But again, he's coming in judgment. So this is sort of a two-edged sword. I guess, again, the metaphor is overused. But on the one hand, it's good that the king is returning. He's coming back to reclaim his land. But the bad thing is he's coming in judgment because his land hasn't been used right, and people need to be punished. So again, we're gonna get both sides of this in Micah. The good, Yahweh is coming back. He's coming to rule. The bad, he's coming in judgment. So the king is going to pass through them, and the king is the Lord, right? Yahweh is coming to rule his people because the people have not been ruling themselves effectively or faithfully. Again, we've already had this kind of iterated. So Hosea 3, afterward, the people of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come with awe to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. And Isaiah has a lot to say about this promised king. So chapter 9 is probably the most famous place, but there are others. For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. The dominion will be vast, and his prosperity will never end. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from now on and forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this. So we will end there tonight.
Thank you, brother. As we close tonight, let's not forget to continue to pray for Naomi Duncan and Miss. Most of y'all might already know Miss Frankie's grandson had a serious accident, and they're not too sure how this is going to end up. I think he's in a coma as well, but it's pretty bad, so we need to continue to remember them. John, would you lead us in prayer?